120 tons of steel. That is the force of a T-72 main battle tank in motion. You've seen the footage: parades in Moscow, desert battles in Iraq, the characteristic explosion where the turret flies 30 feet into the air. The crew inside never has a second to react. Why does this specific tank turn into a steel coffin? The answer lies in its design. But there are two sides to this machine. On one hand, a cheap mass-produced weapon of war. On the other, a mechanical trap for those inside. The T-72 was built for a single purpose. It was designed to overwhelm NATO forces through sheer numbers. It is low, fast, and carries a 125mm smoothbore gun. This weapon can punch through thick armor from 2 kilometers away. It was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. But there is a fatal flaw. It is located directly beneath the feet of the 3 crewmen. The autoloader system holds 22 shells in a circular carousel. There is no heavy shielding between the ammunition and the soldiers. It is a design choice that prioritizes size over survival. The footage shows the result clearly. An anti-tank missile strikes the side. A small jet of molten copper enters the hull. It hits a single propellant charge. Within milliseconds, the entire internal inventory of shells ignites at once. The pressure becomes so intense that the multi-ton turret is ripped from the chassis. Events accelerated during the Gulf War. Hundreds of T-72s were destroyed in the sand. The Americans called it the jack-in-the-box effect. The Iraqi tankers knew the risks. They saw their comrades vaporized in seconds. There was no room for error. But this was only the beginning of the tank's history. The machine has served in dozens of conflicts over 50 years. It has been upgraded, modified, and sold to over 40 countries. In many battles, it was the king of the field. Its profile is so low that it is nearly impossible to hit at long range. Was it a brilliant weapon or a death sentence? The data provides the answer. It depends on whether you value the machine or the men inside. 1971. That was the year the first T-72 rolled off the assembly line. The story starts there. 20,000 units, 40 different countries. These are the core statistics of the T-72 main battle tank. 50 years after its debut, the machine remains a primary weapon on modern battlefields. Footage from Ukraine confirms this reality. T-72s operate on both sides of the front line. They burn in grain fields and fire from urban ruins. The tank is a global constant. Why was it built this way? The answer lies in the rapid evolution of armor after 1945. During the Second World War, tank technology jumped forward by decades in just 5 years. The Soviet Union emerged from the conflict with a chaotic inventory. They maintained heavy tanks, medium tanks, and specialized assault guns. The T-34 was the legendary workhorse of that era, but the T-34 was a crude tool designed for total war. It was a stopgap. Soviet engineers realized the platform had reached its limit. You could not bolt modern optics or heavier guns onto a 1940s chassis. They needed a clean slate. Post-war development was a bureaucratic minefield. Designers fought for funding while generals argued over doctrine. The T-54 and T-55 series followed. These machines became the most produced tanks in human history. 100,000 units left the factories, but they were still iterative designs. They were simple and rugged, yet they lacked a decisive edge. The real breakthrough happened in the 1960s. It was called the T-64. What made the T-64 different? At first glance, it looked like its predecessors, but in reality, it was a technological leap. It featured a compact hull and a revolutionary autoloader. This system replaced a human crew member. The weight saved allowed the tank to carry a massive 125mm smoothbore gun. But this was only the beginning. The T-64 was sophisticated and expensive. It was too complex for mass mobilization. The Soviet military needed something cheaper and more reliable for a global war. They needed a tank that could be built by the thousands in tractor factories. Events accelerated. Engineers took the powerful gun from the T-64 and simplified the rest of the machine. They removed the temperamental engine and the delicate suspension. They replaced them with proven heavy-duty components. The result was the T-72. The footage shows a low silhouette and a cramped turret. It was designed to be a small target. There is no wasted space inside the steel shell. It was a weapon of pure utility. The sound of the V12 diesel engine is unmistakable on the battlefield. Success was immediate. Production lines in the Ural Mountains began churning out hulls. The T-72 was not just a tank, it was a geopolitical tool. The Soviet Union exported the design to every corner of the map. From the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Africa, the T-72 became the face of armored warfare. The era of the universal tank had arrived, 1963. The Soviet Union unveiled the T-64. It was a machine that fundamentally changed the landscape of armored warfare. It featured revolutionary composite armor, a massive smoothbore cannon, and a mechanical autoloader. This tank discarded the five-man crew tradition, replacing the human loader with a machine. The world was shocked. But inside the Soviet military, the reaction was different. High-ranking officers were divided. The T-64 was a complex leap forward, not an evolution. It was an unproven concept. It suffered from mechanical failures during field tests. The engine stalled, the autoloader jammed, the electronics fried under stress. How could a peasant army manage such a machine? This was the primary concern. The T-64 required elite, highly trained technicians. But the Soviet military relied on conscription. They had millions of farmers and factory workers, not engineers. In a global conflict, these men would be the ones sitting in the hatches. They needed a tank they could actually fix in the mud. Cost was the second barrier. The T-64 was expensive. It required specialized factories and rare materials. The Soviet doctrine demanded thousands of tanks, not hundreds. They needed a massive steel wave to wash over Europe. The T-64 was too refined for a war of attrition. It was a precision tool in a world that needed a sledgehammer. A compromise was necessary. Designers began a new project to bridge the gap. They took the advanced DNA of the T-64 and stripped away the complexity. They kept the firepower but simplified the mechanics. They replaced the temperamental engine with a more reliable model. They redesigned the suspension to handle the weight of mass production. At first glance, a retreat in technology. But in reality, a strategic masterpiece. The goal was a tank that regular soldiers could operate without constant breakdowns. It had to be cheap enough to build by the thousands and tough enough to survive the front lines. The engineers finalized the blueprints. The result was a new prototype known as Object 172. This machine was the missing link. It combined modern lethality with industrial simplicity. This was the foundation for the most produced tank in history. There was no turning back. Object 172. After the test results arrived, the machine entered mass production under the name T-72. Officials initially labeled it the mobilization model. The plan was simple. In peacetime, the Soviet Union would produce the high-tech T-64 and T-80 for elite units. The T-72 would only be built in massive quantities if a global war broke out. The plan failed. Full-scale production began almost immediately. The reason was money. The export market for Soviet armor exploded. Arab nations demanded new tanks after years of heavy losses and regional instability. The Kremlin saw the profit margins and signed the orders. Factories began running 24 hours a day. How did the T-72 actually look? At first glance, a copy of the T-64. But in reality, a complete overhaul. It kept the low silhouette. It kept the smoothbore 125mm gun. The engineers installed a new autoloader. It was mechanical, simpler, and more reliable than previous versions. At the time of its debut, this gun was a giant. It was the largest operational tank weapon on the planet. Western NATO commanders panicked. Their standard 105mm rifled cannons were suddenly obsolete. They began a desperate race to upgrade their entire arsenal. Inside the turret, the layout changed. The crew dropped to just 3 men, the driver, the gunner, and the commander. There was no fourth man. The autoloader replaced the human loader entirely. This decision saved massive amounts of space. A human loader needs room to stand, reach for shells, and shove them into the breach. The T-72 removed that requirement. Without a loader, the tank became smaller, lower, and harder to hit. In theory, the machine could fire faster and more consistently than any human. Events accelerated. The tank was no longer just a backup plan. It was the new backbone of the Eastern Bloc. The footage shows the compact turret rotating. The sound of the autoloader cycling is a sharp metallic clatter. The T-72 was ready for the front, 41 tons. That was the weight of the original T-72. In contrast, a modern M1 Abrams reaches 70 tons. This massive weight difference defined the Soviet strategy. The T-72 was lighter, faster, and presented a significantly smaller target for enemy gunners. How did the Soviets achieve this? They traded internal space for speed and protection. The tank reached 70 kilometers per hour on open roads. It packed the same firepower as Western heavyweights, but moved with much more agility. However, there was a flaw. The reverse gear was notoriously slow. It moved at only 5 kilometers per hour. In a retreat, the tank was a sitting duck. The T-72 had a unique survival feature, a snorkel system. This allowed the vehicle to cross rivers up to 5 meters deep. The tank drove directly on the riverbed. A long tube stored behind the turret provided air for the engine and the crew. The footage shows the danger of this maneuver. Water pressure makes opening the hatches impossible. If the engine stalls or a leak occurs, the tank becomes a steel coffin. The crew can only exit once the cabin completely fills with water to equalize the pressure. It requires specialized training and nerves of steel. In reality, crews almost never used it. This sealing technology served a secondary purpose. It acted as a shield against nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. The crew could seal the entire fighting compartment. Air entered only through high-grade radiation filters. But there was a tactical cost. To ensure a perfect seal, the crew had to inflate a thick rubber ring around the turret base. This locked the turret in place. The tank could drive through a poisoned wasteland, but it could not rotate its gun to fire. At first glance, a versatile machine. But in reality, a series of compromises. These systems remain part of the design today. If a nuclear conflict begins, these tanks are built to operate in the fallout. They will crawl through radioactive ruins to engage the survivors. The machine was ready for the end of the world. 22 shells. That is the capacity of the rotating carousel located directly beneath the turret. This autoloader functions with mechanical precision. Each round consists of 2 distinct parts, the projectile and the propellant charge. When the gunner selects a target, the carousel rotates. It brings the specific ammunition type into the loading position. The loading process happens in 2 distinct stages. A mechanical rammer pushes the projectile into the breech first. Then, it pushes the propellant charge behind it. The breech blocks lock into place. After the shot, the system clears the path. The stub casing is automatically ejected through a small dedicated hatch on the rear of the turret roof. The entire cycle takes 8 seconds. The footage shows a consistent, rhythmic operation. A human loader might achieve a faster speed for the first few shots using rounds from a ready rack. However, physical exhaustion is a factor. After 5 shots, a human loader struggles. The tank interior fills with hot brass and toxic fumes. The loader must then dig through storage racks to find specific shell types. The machine does not tire. It maintains the 8-second rhythm from the first shell to the 20-second shell. In theory, the rate of fire never drops unless a mechanical failure occurs. This is the advantage of sustained fire. The tank carries more than just the carousel rounds. Additional ammunition is stowed in various compartments throughout the hull. The crew can manually restock the carousel without retreating from the combat zone. Selection is instantaneous. The commander chooses between high explosive fragmentation for soft targets or armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds for enemy tanks. High explosive anti-tank shells are also available. What happens if the electronics fail? The crew has a backup plan. They can operate the system using a manual hand crank. The speed drops significantly. In this mode, the tank fires only 2 rounds per minute. It was a trade-off between speed and reliability. There was no turning back from this design choice. The mechanical components are visible in the technical drawings. The metal arms move. The gears turn. The system is compact, saving massive amounts of internal space. But this efficiency came with a lethal side effect. One feature gave the T-72 a tactical edge over Western tanks, but this same design became its greatest weakness. The issue was the ammunition storage. Shells sat inside the hull without any protective shielding. 20 additional shells were packed into every available gap. They were tucked behind seats and under floorboards. If a projectile pierced the armor, sparks and molten metal sprayed the interior. The propellant charges ignited instantly. These charges are highly flammable. A chain reaction followed. Internal explosions ripped through the cabin in less than 1 second. The pressure had nowhere to go. For the 3 men inside, there was no time to react. The turret often detached from the hull and flew into the air. Death was instantaneous. The secondary armament was standard. A 7.62 mm PKT coaxial machine gun sat next to the main barrel. On the roof, the commander operated a heavy 12.7 mm DSHK machine gun. Western tankers later inspected the captured vehicles. They described the interior as unbelievably cramped. The gunner and commander sat squeezed between the massive steel gun breech and the cold turret walls. There was no room to stretch or turn. Visibility was poor. Once the hatches clicked shut, the crew relied on narrow periscopes. The Russian military set a strict height limit for tankers at 5 feet 9 inches. Even for these shorter men, the space was a metal coffin. But how did it perform in a real war? The T-72 did not debut with the Soviet Army. Instead, Syria used the tanks against Israeli forces during the 1982 Lebanon War. It was a baptism by fire. A larger test followed. Iraq deployed hundreds of newly purchased T-72s during the Iran-Iraq War. This was the first full-scale conflict involving the platform. But there was a catch. These were export models. The Soviet Union deliberately downgraded the armor and electronics before shipping them to foreign buyers. The tanks the world saw in combat were not the same tanks guarding Moscow. The results were mixed. 1994. The Soviet Union had collapsed 3 years prior. Now, the Russian Federation faced a new crisis. Chechnya declared independence and refused to recognize Moscow's authority. Negotiations failed. The Kremlin decided to use force to reassert control. The T-72 was the backbone of this force. In previous decades, Western intelligence underestimated this tank. They saw poorly trained crews and a lack of coordination with other army branches. Performance in early Middle Eastern conflicts was weak, but the T-72 held a lethal secret. Its 125 mm gun could destroy any NATO tank at standard combat ranges. It was a hammer looking for a nail. December 31st, 1994, New Year's Eve. The plan was simple and brutal. Seize the capital city of Grozny to crush the rebellion in one strike. Russian commanders sent massive columns of tanks into the urban center. The force included T-72s and the cutting-edge T-80. Elite units and BMP armored vehicles followed behind. Heavy artillery and rocket fire hit the city first. The footage shows the result. High-rise buildings reduced to skeletons. The bombardment killed thousands of civilians and turned neighborhoods into rubble. Despite the destruction, the order remained. Drive to the city center, secure the railway station, occupy the presidential palace. The soldiers were not seasoned veterans. Most were young conscripts. They sat in their hatches with no maps and no clear briefing. Many did not know they were entering a combat zone until the first shots rang out. They drove into a trap. The sound of diesel engines echoed off the concrete. Tanks and armored personnel carriers bunched up in narrow streets and bombed-out squares. They were surrounded by high buildings. This was the exact scenario the Chechen fighters wanted. What could possibly go wrong? For the Russian military, the answer was everything. The Chechen teams were organized and highly motivated. They did not hide in the streets. They positioned themselves in basements and on the upper floors of apartment blocks. The Russian tank crews could not aim their guns high enough or low enough to hit them. The Chechens created interlocked fields of fire. The trap was set. The slaughter began. January 1st, 1995. The trap snapped shut. The Chechen fighters waited until the column reached the narrow streets. They let the lead tanks pass deep into the kill zone. Then they fired. Old RPG-7 rockets struck the rear vehicles first. Metal twisted, engines stalled. The entire Russian column came to a dead stop. The armor was now trapped. Front and back were blocked by burning wreckage. There was no room to maneuver and no cover from the surrounding buildings. Snipers and machine gunners opened fire from the upper floors. Rockets rained down from above. They hit the tanks where the armor is thinnest. The Russian crews faced a mechanical flaw. Their tanks and BMPs could not tilt their gun barrels high enough to hit the attackers in the high-rises. It was a massacre. The footage shows black smoke rising from every intersection. 48 hours of urban combat followed. The numbers tell the story. Out of 120 armored vehicles that entered Grozny, over 100 were destroyed. Out of 1,000 soldiers, 800 were killed or captured. The 131st Brigade ceased to exist. Commanders sent reinforcements, but the relief units never reached the center. Chechen squads ambushed them on the outskirts, turning the suburbs into another graveyard. The world saw the photos. Dozens of T-72 tanks sat in the mud with their turrets blown off. It was a matter of cost. A $500 rocket destroyed a $500,000 tank. These shape-charged warheads remain a threat to modern armor today. But this was only the beginning. The Russian military command analyzed the catastrophe. For the Second Chechen War, they changed their tactics. They covered their tanks in explosive reactive armor. They did not just drive in. Instead, they used heavy artillery to level the city first. The lesson was learned in blood. These are the facts of the Grozny campaign. January 1999. The Russian army returned to Grozny. This time, the approach changed. Why did the tactics shift? It was a matter of survival. The command stopped sending isolated tank columns into kill zones. Now, infantry squads moved house to house, flanking the armor. Soldiers shielded the T-72s from close-range ambushes. The tanks no longer drove blindly into narrow alleyways where RPGs waited. The machines looked different. Technicians covered the hulls with Contact 1 explosive reactive armor blocks. These small metal boxes contained explosives designed to detonate against incoming shells. At first glance, the tanks were invincible, but in reality, they were still vulnerable. The ERA block stopped basic RPG-7 rounds, but repeated strikes stripped the armor bare. Tandem-charge warheads arrived on the front lines, piercing the hull easily. The result remained the same. Internal ammunition cooked off, detonating with enough force to launch a 40-ton turret into the air. Losses dropped, but the machine stayed the same. Post-war modernization programs followed. Engineers installed better fire control systems and updated the reactive bricks. They tried to keep the T-72 relevant for the 21st century. But the core design never changed. It was a mass-produced weapon built on World War II logic. 2011, the Syrian civil war began. Urban combat returned on a massive scale. This was the turning point. Western-made anti-tank guided missiles entered the theater. These weapons could obliterate a T-72 from a distance of 1 mile. The footage shows the impact. A single missile strikes the center mass. Cage armor and ERA bricks fail instantly. The tank becomes a steel coffin. There was no safety for the crews. But the ultimate test came later. February 24, 2022. The invasion of Ukraine began. This conflict raised a single question. Is the tank concept dead? For the T-72, the answer was grim. Modern systems like the NLAW and Javelin changed the rules. These missiles do not strike the thick front armor. They fly high and dive vertically into the thin roof. The tank has no defense against a top-down attack. Then came the drones. Cheap commercial quadcopters carry old RPG warheads. Operators pilot them directly into engine vents or open hatches. A $500 drone destroys a multi-million-dollar machine. The visual record is consistent. In one frame, a T-72 maneuvers through a field. In the next, a drone strike occurs. The crew attempts to respond, but the fire is too fast. Thick black smoke pours from the hatches. Steel bars welded to the roof. Metal mesh covering the engine, scraps of rubber hanging from the turret. They call them cope cages. These improvised shields are everywhere on the front lines. Tank crews scavenge anything they can find to survive the swarms of kamikaze drones. It does not work. The footage shows the result. A T-72 burns in an open field. Then comes the signature explosion. The ammunition inside ignites, pressure builds, and the multi-ton turret launches into the air like a jack-in-the-box. Is the tank dead? Not yet. Military experts argue the T-72 remains relevant. There is no other vehicle that can carry a heavy cannon directly into a firefight to support the infantry. But the math is changing. A $500 drone can now disable a $3 million machine. If protection technology does not evolve, the tank becomes a rolling coffin. Modern warfare requires a symphony of air cover, infantry screens, and electronic jamming. Without this support, the T-72 is a target. History shows this cycle of dominance and failure. In earlier conflicts, the T-72 proved its power by crushing American-made M60 Pattons and British chieftains. It was the king of the desert, but the 1990s changed everything. This decade became the darkest period for T-72 crews. The tank was no longer an asset. It was a liability. The first disaster was Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Iraqi T-72s faced a technological wall. They were older models manned by poorly trained crews. On the other side stood the M1 Abrams and the Bradley fighting vehicle. The Americans had thermal sights, night vision, and laser rangefinders. They saw through the smoke and the sand. The Iraqis saw nothing. The sound of the Abrams' 1,200 horsepower turbine filled the air. U.S. armored units moved behind a curtain of airstrikes and TOW missiles. The Abrams used its 120mm gun to fire APFSDS rounds. These kinetic penetrators hit the T-72s from 3 miles away. The Soviet steel offered no resistance. The rounds went through the hulls like a hot knife through butter. The footage from the battlefield was clear. Iraqi tanks were burning before they even spotted the enemy. Operation Desert Storm made the T-72 look like a joke. The world watched as the pride of the Soviet industry was decimated in the sand. But this was only the beginning. The T-72 was about to face a new nightmare. It was moving from the open desert into the narrow streets of the city. It was about to face handheld anti-tank weapons in a meat grinder it was never designed to survive. Events accelerated. There was no turning back.